Muy buenas tardes. Es un verdadero honor para el Festival Internacional de Teatro Universitario poder dar inicio con la conferencia Género y Creatividad, avances al borde del precipicio, que impartirá la doctora Bridget Conor y que nos ayudará en la presentación la maestra Lorena de la Peña. Para información de ustedes, esta actividad la pueden seguir traducida al español por las redes de Facebook, YouTube de Teatro UNAM, de Cultura UNAM, pero también la pueden seguir en inglés, el idioma que originalmente se va a utilizar, a través del webinar que pueden ustedes, al que pueden ustedes acceder a través de la página de Teatro UNAM en el segmento del FITU, del festival. La maestra Lorena de la Peña es actualmente doctorante del posgrado en Artes y Diseño, licenciada en 2010 y maestra en 2003 en Artes Visuales, con mención honorífica por la FAD UNAM. Especialista en Historia del Arte por la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UNAM en 2015 y ha participado en 4 exposiciones individuales y más de 30 colectivas en diversos recintos de la República Mexicana. Ha impartido conferencias, cursos y talleres en instituciones públicas y privadas de la República y es académica de la UNAM desde 2013. Ha formado parte de comités académicos del Ceneval y la UNAM y ha desarrollado y coordinado diplomados de titulación para universidades también privadas. Forma parte de la Comisión Interna de Igualdad de Género de la FAD UNAM y es persona orientadora académica para la atención de casos de violencia de género en la UNAM a partir de agosto de 2018. Sus líneas de investigación son la representación del cuerpo femenino como objeto de deseo en la narrativa occidental con posicionamiento crítico, estética como encuentro del arte y el diseño situada en los estudios de género, decolonialidad, giro afectivo y crítica cultural, y reivindicación de las estéticas negadas, arte popular, arte corporal, producción de experiencias como expresión artística, más allá de la obra trascendental. No podíamos encontrar mejor acompañante para este viaje que Bridget Conor nos desarrollará para la presentación de la investigación que desarrolló para la Unesco y que consideramos absolutamente fundamental en las líneas de trabajo, en los ejes temáticos que el festival está desarrollando. Lorena, Bridget, de verdad muchas gracias por estar aquí. Lorena, estamos en tu voz.
Muchísimas gracias. Voy a presentar a la doctora en español y posteriormente voy a entablar una conversación con ella y voy a presentar la charla en inglés. La doctora Bridget Conor es profesora titular del Departamento de Cultura, Medios e Industrias Creativas del King College de Londres. Sus intereses de investigación se centran en las relaciones y representaciones del trabajo cultural y la producción de mostrar estas desigualdades en las industrias culturales. Es autora es autora de Guión, Trabajo Creativo y Práctica Profesional, un libro del 2014, y también coeditora de Género y Trabajo Creativo, que realizó con Rosalind Hill y Stephanie Taylor en el año 2015. Bueno, pues, doctora, welcome to this chat. I will present this conference. The call of the book that we're going to present is Gender and Creativity, Progress on the Precipice. In this talk, Dr. Conor will discuss why and how is that the cultural and creative industries, including the performing arts, will so often viewed as cool, creative, and egalitarian, continue to be a site of significant inequality. Based on her recent report for UNESCO, Gender and Creativity, Progress on the Precipice, she will discuss what the most recent data tell us about these inequalities on a global scale and how COVID-19 has affected this data. Beyond the numbers, she will also talk about the myths that circulate in culture and the performing arts, myths that continue to perpetuate damaging stereotypes about gender and creativity. Dr. Conor will use examples from her research to consider the ways in which gender inequalities persist in these industries and are frequently unspeakable for artists and performance. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, and we are really, really happy to listen to you.
Lorena, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And Juan, also thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really delighted to be with you all today to speak, as Lorena said, about some of my research. So I'm just going to give a little introduction, and in a second I'm going to share my screen so that I can speak to some images, some statistics, and so you can follow along with me. I'm sorry I have to do this in English. My apologies, but I hope you can follow, and I really look forward to your questions and comments. Lorena and I are going to have a discussion after my talk. So I'm going to share my screen now, and then I'm going to tell you a bit more about what I'm going to do today. Okay, so I hope now you're all going to be able to see this. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so as Lorena said, my name is Bridget Conor. I'm a Pākehā from Aotearoa, New Zealand, originally. And I'm going to say more about that in a second. But as Lorena said, what is my purpose here today? Well, I want to spend some time discussing my research and work in the broad areas of gender, creativity, and inequalities. And I'm going to say more about what I have done in my career to date. Often I focused on film and television production in previous research, so I will say a bit more about that as we go. But for the purposes of this talk, and because I know so many of you are practitioners in theatre, students of theatre, researching theatre, involved in theatre, I've tried to focus my talk there as much as possible in the performing arts and the theatre world when I can, right? But I'll also speak about creativity, culture, and the arts more generally as I go. And this is relevant for me because, to give you a bit of background about myself, I studied film, TV, and theatre at school and at university. I dreamed of going to drama school. I did have dreams once upon a time. I was too scared of the auditions though, so I couldn't quite go through with that. But maybe this is familiar. I continued to study these subjects throughout my university career as an undergraduate, as a master's student in New Zealand, and then as a PhD student in London. I continued to kind of, I don't know, feed my love of the performing arts, of theatre especially, via this research route. And I think you will see this as I go on. So my teaching and my research in some ways actually is me kind of trying to keep my theatrical dreams alive, I guess. It's kind of my creative outlet. And it also means I have a huge amount of privilege in my career now as an academic, because it means I have been able to engage with creatives throughout my career. And that means speak to creatives about the work that they do, interview them about their lives, their dreams and aspirations, and the challenges that they have faced, right, in their creative work. And I've done a few different studies, and I'll kind of refer to these a little bit more as I go. So I studied the New Zealand film industry and the making of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If there are any Lord of the Rings fans out there, then maybe I have some stories for you. I did another study about screenwriting work and screenwriters based in London. And more recently, of course, and the subject of this talk specifically, I conducted this research with Unesco, through which we produced this report. You see the cover here on the slide, Gender and Creativity Progress on the Precipice. So we have used that title for this talk. And of course, I'll say much more about this as we go. But for this talk today, you know, I'm really aware we are here for a particular theme of this festival, a particular stream, which is, I'm sure you all know, sisterhood, insurance and equality, practices of gender equity, sexual diversity, and gender identity. So I'm really trying, as I speak, to focus on those things. So I hope you will see the themes coming through in what I'm going to say. A couple more kind of caveats, and then I'll move into the first part of the talk. Now, it's important, I think, to say that, as you can tell already, I've studied largely English language speaking industries so far. That's because of, my problem that I only speak English fluently. So I'll draw on quite a few examples from that research as I go, but I just wanted to say also right at the beginning that I'm well aware the issues that I'm about to speak about are in some sense maybe universal, but we need to understand how they are experienced differently in different parts of the globe and in different language and national contexts. So, I really look forward to the discussion we will have with Lorena and the questions and comments, hopefully from all of you, so we can understand how do you experience these issues now in Mexico, where most of you, all of you are. How are they similar? How are they different? So I'm not presuming by any means that these are necessarily, universal experiences, but I hope there will be some resonances and similarities, as well as maybe some differences that we can get to. Okay, so here is the structure in terms of what I'm going to say in the next about 40 minutes. I want to provide a few opening remarks about just the themes of gender and creativity and how we can see those things as linked together in particular ways and understood in particular ways. Secondly, I want to just, as part of that, say a little bit more about inequalities in the cultural and creative industries and what we know about those inequalities and how they are understood and experienced. Thirdly, as Lorena said, I then want to say a little bit more about these myths and arguments that I think are really pretty powerful still in lots of different contexts, and that we hear a lot and that are often used to justify these inequalities, right? As a way to prevent us, I think, from pushing for radical change, which is what I think we should all be pushing for. And then, I will be speaking about the UNESCO report as I go, but then I want to really get to the report and highlight a few particular things that I think are really relevant for this talk. So I will say more about the UNESCO report, Gender and Creativity, Progress on the Precipice. And then we will finish up quickly so we can get to the final questions and discussion. And that's kind of really where I want to focus as we go on. So that's the structure. Okay, so part one then, gender and creativity. What do we know about these two concepts that we use every single day and that often we think we know a lot about? I've always been really interested in creativity itself as part of my kind of broader research project and the questions I'm asking. I'm really interested in who or what is labeled as creative, right? Who gets to even have that term associated with them, with their experiences, with the work that they do? What kinds of work is considered to be creative? What kinds of workers, who do we just assume are creative in the world, in a society, without even questioning it? And actually, I'm just as interested then in the other side, right? So if there are creative people over there, then who is assumed to be not creative, right? Or less creative, or, uncreative, if there is such a term. The other important thing, I think, is that there's quite a fundamental contradiction in the arts and cultural industries, which Lorena already mentioned. On the one hand, creativity and culture are widely, I think, viewed as egalitarian, right? As open to all. Creativity is just a kind of a natural human state of being, something that we all do. It's a source of artistic expression, freedom, emancipation, empathy, and so on and so on. So whether it is our job, whether we are paid to be creative or not, it's seen to be this kind of fundamental human capability, right? That we all have, no matter our background, our resources, and so forth. But on the other hand, and here's where the contradiction comes in, if we look at who produces culture, the arts and media, who makes decisions about how culture and media is produced, who has access to these industries, who can sustain careers in these industries, and actually then what we see, you know, on the representation side, who we see on stage, on screen, you know, in culture and media across a whole range of kinds of artistic production. These industries are far from egalitarian, far from equal. Really, the opposite is true. And often, you will see, you know, lots of stats like these. And this is just I just pulled these very quickly. You know, you get illustrations like this all the time. It doesn't really even matter what the industry is. You'll see graphs with gender bias. You'll see particular industries, how many women versus men work in film production or television production, or get awards for particular kinds of artistic production, and so on. So you see these illustrations, you know, now quite a lot. And they all, you know, generally show us one thing, which is that these industries are really highly unequal and exclusive. And they're unequal in terms of gender, of course, which I'll say more about today, but much more than just gender. You know, they're unequal in terms of ethnicity, disability, class, or what we might just call socioeconomic background, age, sexuality, you know, the list really goes on. And these inequalities, you know, replicate and are surprisingly consistent, actually. You know, so no matter where we have these illustrations, where they come from, you know, the data often looks really, really the same across places, regions, and parts of the world. But they're also multifaceted and pretty complex. So we want to be quite careful, I think, also of generalizations here. But when we look closely at this data, right, and about inequalities, the types of, what kinds of inequalities we see in different kinds of industries, we do see patterns, right, that are worth, that I think are worth highlighting. And one of these patterns, which I highlight in this UNESCO report, which I'll say more about soon, two trends, which are called vertical and horizontal segregation. And this is, you know, kind of been well documented in some of the other research that's been done in this area, particularly a book from David Hesmanhelge and Sarah Baker, which was published in 2015, called simply Creative Labor. They demonstrated that gender segregation, if we just take gender segregation as the focus for a minute, works both horizontally and vertically in all kinds of cultural industries. So on the vertical axis, most of those in positions of power, right? That is funders, gatekeepers, chief executives, senior managers in cultural institutions, are generally older and identify as male. And horizontally, if we look along the horizontal axis, more women are represented, many more women in those types of work that are sex typed as, you know, quote unquote, female professions. And I put that in scare quotes for a reason, because of course that is, you know, this is a social construction. But the sex typed as female professions is important. So things like makeup and costume departments, for example, or other kinds of, you know, less well-paid, you know, office administration roles across the arts and creative industries. Those are, you know, there are jobs in a creative industry, but, you know, they're less well-paid and of course, less prominent behind the scenes. And men are overrepresented in types of work which are historically sex-typed as masculine, things like backstage work, lighting, and so on. And the histories are really important. I mean, this goes back actually to the earliest days of some of these industries where we get this segregation and we see it play out, and things have really not fundamentally changed. Now, if we turn then and look at some really recent data, it's interesting to see how this horizontal and vertical segregation kind of maps onto some very contemporary up-to-date statistics. So I'll be really interested to see what you think of these when we get to the Q&A, but these statistics come from, again, the United Kingdom. And this is from some very recent research about the UK theatre industries. And if you want to have a look, this is from something called the Women in Theatre Forum Report. So just released a few months ago, the beginning of 2021. And what it does is collate data and evidence from across the United Kingdom's performing arts industries. It's not often we get such kind of, I think, comprehensive data, even in particular industries like this, so it's useful. And I've just pulled a few illustrations of some of this data so you can get a sense of it. Just to show the first graph here at the top, that is women's theatre companies, which receive what's called Arts Council National Portfolio Organisation funding. I'm sure you have an equivalent, but the Arts Council funds all arts in the United Kingdom. And this graph here shows that out of all of that funding between 2015 and 2018, 0.64% was given to women's theatre companies. And actually below that, you see that the stats are not much better for disability or disabled-led theatre companies, or what's called in the UK, Black and minority ethnic theatre companies. The stats are, incrementally better, but still, pretty terrible. I mean, that might also tell us something about how simply theatre is funded and how much of the funding goes to theatre as a medium. But we'll put that to the side just for now. The second graph there is about caring responsibilities, a topic I will come back to quite a bit. Twice as many women as men working in the performing arts there say they have changed their work roles due to caring responsibilities. And I'm assuming they're changing the work role means reducing hours of work, right? As opposed to increasing hours of work. And we see the difference there, 44% women versus 23% men. And just to go back to what I said before, the bottom graph I think here is really interesting. That's just showing that women are underrepresented throughout the theatre industry. And what I think is important about this is we have across the theatre industry, really broadly speaking. So we have award winners for the biggest theatre awards in the UK, the Olivier's. Theatre critics, many more men than women, as you can see. University professors of drama, also the stats are still not great. Boards, that is the kind of the governance boards of theatre companies, technical staff, artistic directors, performers, slightly better, but still the percentage of women to men is well below 50%. So again, I think really useful to see how horizontal and vertical segregation works across a range of different kinds of data gathering that we might want to do. Again, really interested to see how that might map onto to what's happening in Mexico. Now, I think what's interesting is that these kinds of illustrations and this kind of data has spurred, I think, a really interesting debate, certainly in my experience in the United Kingdom in about the last 5 years. Much more of this research is being conducted, which is a really important first step, right? We need this kind of data so we can see what the problem is. And we have a lot of data now that tells us how bad things, right, still are. But more than simply these hard numbers, we're also getting more research that is the kind of research that I do, right? That's qualitative research, where you're conducting interviews with creative people from different industries. Ethnography, where you're observing creative work and how it is taught, how it's produced, and so forth. That is using broadly sociological methods to document and understand the experiences of people working in theatre, for example, working in film and television production, whatever it might be. So you're getting this quite rich, I think, qualitative data produced as well. And that's really important to have both of those things. And all of this research makes these inequalities, importantly, more visible. And that's also really crucial because it helps us to label these industries for what they are. Which is for vehicles of, often these industries are vehicles of sexism, racism, and other forms of harassment and discrimination that shouldn't be acceptable in any workplace, right? Let alone a creative workplace. So this helps us, we can see what the inequalities are, and it gives us, I think, some ammunition, right, in our fight to change things, to make things better, to turn these statistics around, and so on. However, as many scholars doing this kind of work have noted, besides the fact that we know more about them, often still they are what my colleague Rosalind Gill calls unspeakable inequalities. And I mean unspeakable actually often for creative workers themselves, right? If you are an actor or a screenwriter or a lighting technician or a makeup artist, whatever it might be, or a teacher, you know, whatever. And if you experience gender-based discrimination or another kind of discrimination in your workplace, in your creative workplace, it can be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to speak up about that. To do so often is to threaten your job and your livelihood, certainly to threaten your reputation. And because, as I say in the Unesco report, these are flexible industries, they are often freelance workplaces, and very much, therefore, reputation-based businesses. It is all about personal networks and networking. You know, the stats here are not, we know what the stats are, but when it comes to our own personal experience, you know, it's all about who we know and kind of maintaining one's reputation and status to move from one job to the next. That's what really matters. So some other interesting work has kind of shown what the personal network effect can be in these industries. So just one example of how this is illustrated. This comes from some research into the Australian film industry. So again, a kind of different national context, but I think it's really interesting because this is what is called social network analysis, where these researchers, Deb Verhoeven and Stuart Palmer, kind of map the network of a particular industry. So here, this is, as I've put here on the right, pink dots, men working exclusively with men in the Australian film industry, and versus the green dots, men working with women. And you can see the illustration here. I mean, this is kind of the old boys network, as it might be called, has been called, but a really nice illustration of the difficulty actually of speaking out, you know, especially if you are already marginalized in these industries, because, you know, you aren't an older man who has lots of other older men to kind of work with. So the reputation is important, and it's why still these industries are often pretty unspeakable. So, you know, that kind of leads to another paradox in a way. You know, we have the cool creative egalitarian vision of creativity and the reality. And here's a kind of another paradox. You know, on the one hand, we know more than we ever have before potentially about these inequalities. And you'll see, if you wish to read my full UNESCO report after this, you don't have to though. I'm going to give you a pretty good summary here, I think. We know what these inequalities look like, and we know the numbers. But there's still a resistance, a real resistance to change, often on the part of those that work in the industry and those that kind of have the ability to make change. And we need to, that's the next part of the talk I want to get to. Why are we not seeing change happening more quickly? And again, just another note to say, you know, I'm continuing to speak about gender, but there has been a lot of talk about how we can't see gender inequality alone, you know, as one kind of inequality that's separate from other kinds of inequality. A really interesting intervention in the discussion in the United Kingdom that I just saw last week was a lecture given by a screenwriter at the Edinburgh Television Festival about disability in the UK television industry. And this was a scathing attack on the United Kingdom and the television industry there for, as this writer calls it, the deplorable prejudice against disabled people in these industries. He talks in a really kind of passionately about how the industry has entirely failed disabled people and how that industry is completely inaccessible to anyone who might identify as having a disability of some kind. And he goes on to argue for quotas. You know, he says the industry needs to fundamentally change to become more accessible and open to people with disabilities. So, you know, there are always new interventions that are kind of pushing this discussion forward. And I think that's really, really important. And I'll come back to this point in a second. Now, to move on then to part 2, justifications for a lack of change, because we get these all the time, and I think they're really important to highlight. Again, I do this in the UNESCO report. So in my own research, you know, not only have I spoken to creative people, those who work in these industries, but often that means also speaking to policymakers or to, you know, decision makers in these industries. So you're talking to them about these inequalities, what they think of them. And often in those discussions, a number of arguments come up, which I think we could also call quite powerful myths about why things can't change, you know, or why it's not possible to make change, or why it's not appropriate, you know, to push for change. And I just wanted to highlight a few of these here. I wonder if some of them will be familiar to you. I think they're important to note. So the first argument or myth that I have come across a lot in doing this work is the meritocracy myth, which is often, you know, the kind of shorthand is it's all about talent. You know, talent is all that matters in these industries, right? And we hear this a lot, you know, talent will rise to the top. And therefore, discriminatory hiring practices, or, you know, just hiring those that you know and like, that look and sound like you know, that becomes justified because it's all about merit or talent. And again, those personal relationships and networks, or even the nepotism that might be built into these industries, you know, that's kind of, that's pushed to the side or kind of, yeah, rendered again invisible. And this is used a lot. I mean, meritocracy is kind of has been ascendant in this kind of neoliberal discourse in the United Kingdom, certainly for some time. I mean, meritocracy is often, I think the shorthand of that is kind of talent plus hard work equals success, you know, and it's really pretty powerful, I think. And you hear arguments about this a lot. Just work hard and you'll make it. You know, and you hear this from creatives, of course, a lot. It's all about talent. I just worked really hard. And if you're a decision maker, you just say, well, we just appoint the best people to the job. You know, it's not about their background. It's not about where they're from. If they're talented, you know, they'll make it. But interestingly, some other research conducted in the United Kingdom in 2017, researchers who spoke to decision makers, to people in charge in the creative industries, found that those with the strongest belief in meritocracy, maybe not surprisingly, were those that were already most privileged, right? They were already in the highest paid positions. And best rewarded. So they're already at the top, and they're arguing, well, it's all about merit and talent. You know, easy to make that argument when you're up there. But of course, that kind of argument totally obscures the wider structural inequalities that we know mean that many talented people that have been highly educated in these fields never get into these industries, or they get into the industries, but they really struggle to maintain a career, sustain a career, build a sustainable career. So, you know, again, a fundamental contradiction. I mean, we know certainly in the United Kingdom, I've found, and in parts of Europe, Western Europe, continental Europe, many more women than men now are studying for higher degrees in a range of relevant disciplines, the cultural and media industries, practical courses in filmmaking and screenwriting. Those are the kinds of courses I've taught for a long time. Many more women than men study and are gaining the qualifications, but we're not seeing those graduates moving into those industries in growing numbers, and we're certainly not seeing them moving into decision-making positions at all. So that really kind of flies in the face, again, of the kind of meritocracy or talent argument. The numbers just don't hold up there, but it's still a very powerful myth. And I think that's really destructive. I mean, we really need to call that out when we see it, because it powerfully maintains the status quo, and it allows those that are currently in power to stay there, right? And to do very little to agitate for real change. The second argument that you hear quite a bit is a version of, you know, it's getting better. You know, Well, things still aren't great. Yeah, the numbers in theatre or film or television are not great, but they're better than they used to be. You know, that kind of an argument. And of course, yes, you could look at particular industries or particular subsectors of industries and note in the stats, you know, some incremental rate of change, you know, which we can see as positive. But just as likely, you will see statistics that things are getting worse, not better. I mean, one prominent example of this that we can see in hindsight was the 2007-2008 financial crisis and its aftermath. I mean, in the UK, the television industry contracted hugely and women lost their jobs at a rate of 6 times that of men as a result of the financial crisis. And you know, of course, we're currently living through a crisis of a whole other kind. I will say more about COVID-19 before I finish. But I think we have to be really, really careful about this argument that things are getting better. Especially now, the consequences in a post-pandemic crisis, we don't know yet, but you know, they already look to be very, very serious. And, you know, if we look at certain other vectors of inequality, if we look at representation of, you know, ethnicity, ethnic groups, again, disability, things have never gotten better, you know, and they have certainly at times gotten worse over time. So we have to be really, really careful about that. It's getting better argument. The third one is often about motherhood, or sometimes, you know, parenting, but more specifically, motherhood is used as a kind of a justification or an argument for why things don't need to change. And the argument, you know, is kind of, it's simple. The argument is, okay, well, you know, women maybe get into these industries, but because they have the biological, some have the biological capacity to have children, and if they do have children at some point, well, then, of course, you know, they will step out of the industry for a while, or they will step out and then they will go back and they will just work part-time. They have to manage their caring responsibilities. So, you know, that's just the way it is. We don't need to make any changes there. But I think that's a really tricky and problematic argument. You know, again, it's often assumed that this is all women's responsibilities, right? Of course, men are parents too. Men take on caring responsibilities and work in these industries, but it's often seen to be, you know, a woman's responsibility. You know, they take that on, and therefore, you know, there's nothing we need to do as a society or as an industry to change. But of course, there are things that we could do. You know, there are lots of things we could do. To extend the social safety net in these industries, to make childcare or other kinds of care more affordable, and in fact, to make it more routine, you know, in the film and television or theatre industries, for example. They could provide childcare on a film set, I think, if they wanted, but often it's just not the norm, and it's not done. But I think, you know, that's often a reason, again, for not pushing for change. And, you know, all these issues around childcare responsibilities, unpaid domestic work have taken on a whole new tenor, I think, as a result of COVID-19, the fact that many more people are working from home and are often juggling working from home with parenting and childcare and other kinds of caring responsibilities. So it goes well beyond simply motherhood now. And it's something we have to really think more seriously about in terms of, yeah, again, thinking about these structural inequalities that impede everyone from juggling, you know, paid work with unpaid domestic work and caring work of different kinds. Okay, now what I want to do for the latter part of my talk is move and say a bit more about the Unesco report specifically. In particular, a couple of themes in that report that I really want to highlight, as they are particularly relevant to the themes of this conference. So the UNESCO report was published. It was published in March this year and launched in June. And just to give you a little bit of background, I mean, I was asked to write this report at the end of 2019. This is pre-COVID. You know, we start to work on this report. And this was a collaboration with UNESCO in which I had access to their really huge global database of statistics, like policy interventions, and projects that have been set up to try to, you know, move towards gender equality, in particular cultural and creative industries. Gender equality has been a global priority for UNESCO since 2017, and it's already mainstreamed across all of their programs. And this report is a really particular kind of monitoring and advocacy tool for the implementation of the 2005 Convention, which all the member states of UNESCO have signed up to. And of course, it's also relevant and tied to the fulfillment of particular UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 5, which is focused on gender equality and empowering women and girls, and SDG 16, which is about promoting peaceful and inclusive societies and sustainable development. So I wrote this report, I started writing in 2019, and then in early 2020, of course, COVID hit. So I wrote and rewrote this report in lockdown. I think it would be fair to say this was a challenge, to say the least, for me, but also for the UNESCO team. But COVID became really crucial, of course, to the report and what it says. So I will say more about those findings in a second. As I've just done here in this talk, the report kind of begins with a few sections about like what we know, like a really kind of careful accounting of what we know about, you know, vertical and horizontal segregation, as I've just discussed, gender pay gaps in cultural industries, which I haven't had time to speak about today, gender inequality in the workforce and culture and the arts, and also participation, right, in culture and the arts around the world. The report is also really detailing progress, you know, so the extent to which every UNESCO member state has made their own progress towards achieving gender equality in particular industries, culture and the arts specifically. So all the member states are asked to report on their progress, and then in the report we also summarize that progress, and, you know, importantly, highlighting where we can examples of best practice, you know, what is happening in different parts of the world, concrete interventions, policy tools, projects that are having a measurable impact, you know, so lots of kind of positive interventions there that we could highlight. And there are a couple of themes in the report that I just really wanted to highlight in this talk to give you a flavor. Again, really relevant to what we are discussing. Apologies, that's what the report looks like. You've already seen that, the cover. So firstly, one of the themes throughout the report that I thought was very crucial to kind of foreground, to me, the related themes of intersectionality and gender diversity. I know, important for this theme for the festival. It's really crucial, I think, that as we speak about these issues, we really start to think beyond binary thinking wherever we can. And that is a challenge. That is a challenge for reasons that I will get to. But as I've already said, you know, we can speak about gender inequality and experiences of that, but we really have to think about the ways that inequalities intersect. You know, how, especially multiple inequalities, gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, age, these all interact in people's lives, and especially in the lives of minorities. And the experience of gender inequality and therefore harassment, you know, abuse, vulnerability, whatever it is you might experience is particularly compounded, you know, when you are experiencing more than one vector at a time. It's also really important to note that even with data gathering efforts, there's very little information about gender diversity and non-binary genders. Even the data that we utilize on the report is often limited, right, to kind of sex disaggregated data we have, and you've already seen some of it in what I've shown you, how many men are working in the industry, how many women are working in the industry, and nothing in between. And that is often because these surveys are formulated along binary lines. And of course, in many countries, it's not legally possible to identify with a gender other than male or female. But I still think it's really important that the language we're using is that of gender diversity. And we try to integrate that into the UNESCO report wherever we can. Secondly, and this relates to the first point, the issues of safety and well-being. In the end, I dedicated a whole chapter to this in the report because I think it's so important. I'm going to kind of come back to COVID in a second, but yeah, to highlight safety and well-being, it's really clear that those who identify as women or as gender diverse, and the stats speak to this so clearly, they are much more likely to suffer harassment, violence, abuse, bullying, a general lack of safety in all workplaces, and of course, in cultural and the arts workplaces. And, fundamentally, safety and well-being are prerequisite for gender equality, for any kind of equality, and of course, for artistic freedom. And some indicative stats just to kind of illustrate this. Again, these are in the report. I'm just kind of highlighting them so you can see. 7 out of 10 women working as journalists and other media workers said, this is 2018, so a few years ago, they'd experienced more than one type of harassment, threat, or attack in the previous year. And the majority of respondents reported an increase in all types of threat, both on and offline over the past 5 years. I mean, it's an exponential increase. And FreeMuse, one of the organizations that really has done great, consistent research on artistic freedom, has really kind of shocking stats about women artists and violations against them, and artworks, of course, just kind of representing women, feminism, and so forth. 74% of violations were acts of censorship. This is 2020, so very recent. And the main rationales used to silence women: indecency and religion. And, importantly, 57% of the violators, at least as FreeMuse identifies it, are government entities, state entities, not simply, kind of anonymous trolls, online. It's a much wider threat than this. Women artists across all industries, those that identify as women, face discriminatory treatment, especially in countries which impose legal obstacles on their participation in the cultural sector. We could talk on and on about this. Women and gender diverse people often still suffer intolerable levels of gender-based violence in all parts of the world, and that impacts upon the cultural and arts industries as it does on all industries. I think it's very important to make that clear. Even in the most privileged, creative professions, various mechanisms we now know are used to silence women who speak up about something like harassment or abuse. We've seen, in the last years with the Me Too movement, the use of non-disclosure agreements, legal agreements to, again, make all of this invisible and unspeakable. And of course, online trolling and cyber harassment is now just a huge problem for women artists of all kinds who face many more personal attacks than those who identify as men. Now, I want to kind of sound a note of optimism here because this is really important, and I identify some really interesting examples of best practice, really interesting work that's being done in different places, and just a few to highlight for you here as I do in the report. In Peru, some really interesting developments at the National Library, the Alternative Book Fair, and really interesting gender inclusive performing arts training at universities, I think particularly relevant for the audience today. I also highlight some really interesting developments. One in Indonesia, the Cinematic Gak Harus Toxic campaign. You know, a really interesting example of the kind of an Indonesian version of Me Too and the impacts it's had in an industry which is still very, very hostile to women, and which the state often is as well. And in my home country, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Screen Women's Action Group, I also highlight all of these initiatives. What's important about them is that they are, again, highlighting safety and well-being as a priority, you know, for all artists and creatives, and especially for those, you know, that are vulnerable, right? Already vulnerable, already subject to attack and harassment, and already kind of feeling the effects of these structural inequalities. I'm not going to read this quote, but one of the best quotes, I think, in the whole report comes from Lisa Bonner Rahman, who is, you know, one of the like leading figures in the Indonesian campaign. You know, she's really just calling out this industry, but I think it says so much more about, like, you know, what we need to think about here. This whole industry is still very misogynistic, she says, and she goes on to say, every person is entitled to a safe and supportive working environment, free of contempt and violence. Women in the film industry are no exception. This is not something we should actually need to fight for. And I think that's very well said. It should be a normal and standard condition of work, you know, which of course is true, but we're not there yet, right? So still, I think really important to highlight the good work that's happening in particular places. Now, I've been talking for quite a long time. I'm well aware I want to move towards the end, but I just wanted to say a little bit more by way of kind of conclusion about COVID-19, and then I will quickly finish so we can open up to discussion. You know, I think it's really important, as I've said so far, COVID-19 is potentially a crucial, well, it's not potentially, it is a crucial turning point. Just for our lives, of course, and our livelihoods, but also specifically, you know, for our livelihoods as creatives, as artists, the future of these industries, and progress towards gender equality. Like, a lot is on the line here, and if this explicitly relates to safety and well-being, of course. So again, the final chapter of the report is dedicated to COVID-19 and after, you know, where are we right now? That was the trickiest thing to write, because of course we were writing as it's unfolding, you know, and it still is. So, you know, already there would be a whole lot more we could write for the report, I think, and add to that final chapter. What I could write at the time was, as you can imagine, the evidence is pretty worrying, right? If things were already not so good and the stats like are pretty hard to read, you know, I think we should be really, really concerned. And again, this relates back to what I've just said. You know, for example, we've seen a serious increase in intimate domestic violence, and just generally a reduction overall in safety and well-being for people, but especially for women and gender diverse people, for those who are already vulnerable. You know, just the kind of state of being, you know, is very, very difficult for people right now. Already, I think we've seen, again, a serious increase in inequalities in other things I've already mentioned: unpaid domestic work, caring responsibilities. If we're all now working at home, decisions have to be made about who does what. You know, again, the evidence is showing us that women have taken on an extra burden from all of this, that's made it very, very hard for all kinds of work to continue. And another important point for all of us is that we've simply seen a decline in support for arts and culture generally. That's certainly been the case in the United Kingdom and New Zealand. I mean, there have been some support packages for areas of the arts and culture, but many of these industries and practitioners are struggling hugely, to say the least. I read some stories about the severe difficulties facing the theatre industry in Mexico as a result of the pandemic, the shutting down of theatres, job losses. this is the case across the world. So we've got a number of things that are kind of coming together here, which are really concerning. Now, the evidence that I was able to present in the report was, you know, it was very hard to bring it together. There have been some surveys that have been conducted in parts of the world about kind of, you know, loss of income for women creatives, in particular arts and cultural sectors. So I present what I can. But I think we will get a lot more evidence about really what the material impact has been on particular industries, like as we go on. It's hard to get a clear sense of how the data that I've already presented to you will be impacted now and in the future. Again, potentially there is some hope, or at least I think we really need to look for some hopeful signs when we can. One interesting thing that I highlight is that across Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay, a survey was done that looked at all the public policy mechanisms that were aimed at mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on cultural workers specifically and on cultural creative industries. And a huge number, you know, there was a huge number of them. What is it? 223 public policy mechanisms in place. That's a really good sign. You know, there is work that's being done to support workers and these industries. However, and I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that very few have, you know, any kind of gender equity lens, you know, within it. So there's a general policy, public policy support mechanisms aimed at supporting these workers, but nothing that's really looking, and this is the case with almost all these COVID-19 kind of support mechanisms that have been put into place, very, very few are building, you know, just a kind of gender awareness, let alone, you know, trying to preserve and promote gender equality in these policy mechanisms. So still like some serious blind spots here that we really need to address if we want to see this progress, you know, made rather than being kind of terribly eroded, which is why the report is called, you know, Progress on the Precipice. Okay, I want to conclude now. I've definitely been talking for way too long. It's enough. To kind of how to end, you know, it's like a lot to take in, I think. And I'm sure like there's a lot we can think about theoretically, but a lot of this, you know, impacts us personally in many different ways. You know, I even have written this talk in lockdown here in New Zealand. It's been, you know, a real challenge to do so. And, you know, luckily I've been able to do that in a safe and secure kind of space. It's still been very challenging. But I think what's important is, you know, this is the moment that we really need to be aware about what is at stake. And we need to discuss and think collectively as much as possible about, you know, what can we do together to ensure we don't move backwards, you know, by like 10, 20, 100 paces. So a few things to say before I finish. I mean, we know cultural industries and the arts already are often highly unequal and exclusionary. And this is something we should still be talking about, I think, a lot more than we currently are. We also really need to call out those kind of common sense arguments that I said earlier that are used even with, you know, not in a time of crisis, but just in, you know, normal times. The arguments that are used to kind of shut down debate and discussion. Or, you know, when we hear people saying, oh, we don't need to worry about this stuff, there are more important things going on somewhere else, you know, don't believe them. This is really, really important for all of us. And I think that knowledge we can gain from the stats, from talking to people about their experiences, from documenting those experiences, and for pushing for change, you know, this is a moment where change can be made. There has been kind of, so much upheaval anyway. We can remake these industries to be more equitable, to be safer, right? That's really, really important. And just more accessible and open to all as they should be. So I have some final kind of questions, I guess, before I kind of finish and open up, and Lorena, you and I can discuss. I'm just really interested in how these issues resonate with all of your experiences in the theatre industry, but I'm sure more broadly in the performing arts and universities. I'm interested in whether the myths and the arguments that you might get are the same, or are there different arguments? I'm very interested in that. I guess my two final questions are hard to answer, but I hope we can get there somehow, is what do we want and need right now for lasting change, you know, and what are the lessons we can take from the last 18 months that we can actually use in a productive way? But also, of course, in an ongoing way, what are the barriers to change? Because we need to speak about those more rather than less. So I'm going to finish there. I'm going to open it up. Questions, comments. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you're all still awake. And of course, beyond this Q&A discussion time we'll have now, there's my email address. So I would love to hear from you all afterwards if you have more points you want to make and we don't get a chance to get to them. So thanks. And yeah, questions, comments. Let's talk.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very accurate summary and for all your work that you put this book together. I especially appreciate your generosity in sharing it with our UNAM community for this university. Well, I'm going to read the first question of the webinar. Okay. It's from Michelle Munoz. Greetings, Professor Bridget. I was a master's student back in 2017 in the CMCA department. My question today is, what, yeah, maybe you remember her. What kind of policies can be taken as good examples to move forward equality?
What are good examples of policy?
Yeah.
Oh, good question. And hi, it's great to see. It's great to know you're out there. Well, in the report, you know, we're able to highlight a lot of examples of policy that has the potential to create change. I mean, I guess it depends. Maybe the next question is, what kind of policy are we talking about? You know, we could think about policy mechanisms that are kind of blunt instruments, right? Like that just target the numbers straight away. You know, like we could just talk about a quota system, you know, that could be called a relatively blunt instrument. You just suddenly say, okay, we're going to have a quota, you know, we want there to be 50-50 gender equality, you know, in, you know, yeah, what theatre productions we're going to produce at the National Theatre for the next 5 years. You know, we're going to make sure that we hire 50% men, 50% women, and we're just going to kind of do it that way. So you can have a really blunt instrument like that, which makes a difference, you know, pretty quickly. You know, we've had good examples of this. I think it was the Swedish Film Institute, but I know in Ireland as well, the Republic of Ireland, you know, they just kind of decided we want to get to 50-50 straight away. I think the Swedish Film Institute did that in 2.5 years. You know, they just said, we need to make the change. And of course, it wasn't simply about like making that pronouncement and then making it happen. You know, they had to be accountable to themselves and make sure, okay, well, what are we then doing to support screenwriters or playwrights who are developing new work? You know, women who haven't been given opportunities before, we need to give them more development opportunities so that they can develop the plays that then we're going to kind of produce. So I think it was not simply a quota, there was more to it than that, but you know, that's entirely possible. Jack Thorne, who I mentioned, the screenwriter who gave the talk about disability in the UK television industry, he argued for the same thing. He said we need quotas starting right now, that are going to ensure that more people who identify as having a disability are welcomed into the industry. And then the industry is going to have to change, right? And it's going to have to become more accessible in every way. Now, that does something, but I suppose the issue with that is it doesn't necessarily change the kind of culture, right, of these industries. That's the kind of the soft stuff that's harder to just like put a policy in place and see kind of immediate change. But, something else that I talked about quite a bit with UNESCO in the writing of the report was actually, it was about education. Right? It was about policies you could put in place to educate. And of course, it's about, education around gender diversity, around safety and well-being, for all of us as students, at university and whatever kind of cultural and arts courses it is. But it's also about training media workers, right? So it would be about, how can you educate, journalists or people working in a theatre company, about gender sensitivity, about, about pronouns for gender diversity, all these little things. I mean, they seem small, but if you are if you're thinking about like a policy that's really going to create a cultural change, like it's, I think, really about education around kind of gender understanding, about understanding what inequalities are and how they work. I mean, sometimes we have things like unconscious bias training. We certainly have them we had them in our university in London, which is like one day, where you learn a bit more about your own unconscious bias. But I think it's about more than that. It's about kind of like building education around gender equality, the realities of kind of gender-based violence. All of this stuff I think needs to be built in much sooner, to all of our understanding as we become creative and media workers. If we have that understanding as we come into a workplace, I think it's much easier for us to effect cultural change. There are more like examples of kind of, I think, good policies in the report, things like, changing the funding pipelines, changing the governance structures, ensuring like governance of arts and cultural institutions is more gender diverse. So there are lots of mechanisms that are like at our disposal. But yeah, I think it is about changing the numbers, but it's also about like thinking more creatively actually about how to change the culture in these industries.
In the same vein, I don't know what to be repetitive, but I would like to take the opportunity to make the necessary emphasis about this topic. At the present in Mexico, there is a lot of criticism of affirmative action measures to achieve equality. In Mexico especially. There are still allegations of meritocracy. You mentioned this in the book and in the presentation, but I would like you share with us some thoughts of the intersectional approach of the importance of gender quotas to achieve equal opportunities in the sex. I remember you mentioning the Sor Juana Prize for Literature, for example. Especially in countries where other forms of discriminations are present, such as in Mexico, and even more so at the time like the present, in the middle of the pandemic. Why is an affirmative action plan for equality necessary, and who should be involved in making it happen?
Wow, great question, Lorena. Let me think. I mean, yeah, this is really interesting, that the context, as you're saying, in Mexico, the fact that there is a resistance to affirmative action. I mean, I think I would say exactly the same about the United Kingdom right now. I mean, and I'm afraid we can't separate this from the political climate. There's a very conservative government in power there. And affirmative action has become, really dirty, concept. This is seen to be exactly right, going entirely against the principles of meritocracy, which are very fundamental to that kind of conservative mindset. we're not allowed to talk about, structural inequality. Things like critical race theory are also under attack. So there's a wider attack, I think, against this kind of thinking, which is a huge challenge. Now, sorry, what was the second part of your question? Apologies.
Who needs to be involved for make it happen? Because you point in the beginning and in the end that it's not just something from the government to make it possible. We need a plan of action. Can you
we do.
Tell us about this?
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. I mean, actually, in terms of who needs to be involved in making it happen, I think the really important thing is, the broader the base for, agitating for change, the better. We really, I think, need to build a coalition, and build it actually from both within and outside the arts and cultural industries, particularly, like, for example, creative people in certain contexts would be considered, elite, right? Elite workers who are paid very well and are, often highly educated. And that might be true, absolutely, to an extent. But I also think creative people are often, highly precarious. They're often working multiple jobs. They sometimes have income, but they sometimes don't. They're in a really, really precarious position. And in that respect, precarity is key, because experiences of precarity can be a way that you can link with other workers in other industries, that are experiencing really, really similar forms of gender-based violence, exclusion, whatever. Precarity is often a defining feature here. So, I think who is involved? Well, obviously creative workers themselves, where they can speak up. And, again, if you are a creative person and you have some security and decision-making power, it's really, really important for them to speak up, although of course often it's hard for them to do so. But also, I didn't get to mention it in the talk, but more and more in the places that I studied, creatives might not be members of a union, but new coalitions of union forces can also be valuable. So you've got creatives, you've got unions that might support other kinds of precarious workers, and also kind of activist groups are really important. I don't know if it would be I'd be really interested to hear if there are any examples of this in Mexico, but both in the United Kingdom and New Zealand, there have been some interesting new union groups that have formed explicitly for precarious workers across different kinds of industries. There is one group called the Precarious Workers Brigade, which have brought together precarious workers from lots of different kinds of industries to advocate, just for the livelihoods of freelance workers who are also often precarious and also often are suffering, because they're vulnerable, they're less well paid, they're often women from minority backgrounds and so on. So we have creatives. I think unions where they are visible can be really important, activist groups. And also, I think this is where creatives also often work in universities. It's really much certainly the case for me in my my department. I've been a researcher for a long time, but many of my colleagues are also creatives, right? They are playwrights or screenwriters, or they've worked as an actor and they've come in to teach in universities. And I actually think universities are really an important part of the agitation for change that we need. Now that's tricky because, again, there's a lot of hostility, I think, towards academics, towards researchers, towards this kind of new woke elite. But I think it's actually important for those of us in universities who may have, some security to kind of build this coalition. Because if we can speak openly about what the issues are, what the inequalities are, what they look like, we can also propose solutions. And I think we can bring groups together. you know, universities can sometimes be hostile to this kind of organizing, but we don't have to organize in the university space, right? Like we can be, I think, out in these industries talking to people, because we're often bridging the divide between the university or the research sector and the, you know, the creative arts sectors. So I think there's a way that maybe we can, in a productive way, like build a dialogue, which we kind of need for our teaching as well.
Thank you. I will share a comment from Facebook Culture from UNAM, from Blanc Sutera. She said that she believed that there is still a need for research on gender equality among teachers at UNAM, from the home environment to teaching at COVID. And I think this is a subject very important, living and making all the job that you have to do as a scholar, but at the same time, what is implied, as you said, motherhood and other things.
Yeah, so are you wondering about the particular, position that we are in?
It's a comment from her that she said that we need to make a research about it. So it's a comment, but it's important. And I think in Mexico, this book could be an example of what kind of things we can start pointing to check how we are. Well, I will share as well another question from Michelle Munoz. She said, it's been very difficult to organize as union in Mexico. I believe due to the history of corruption linked to them. Most workers in creative industry do not belong to a formal organization to participate in policy making. It's a comment too.
Yeah. Yeah, Michelle, this is again, it's a really good point. And I think some of that is obviously like particular to your context, but yeah, I think it's a broader comment. You know, I mean, historically unions, again, have been largely male dominated organizations. You know, it's not often that we have really, really strong women union leaders, at least not historically. So it's not like the union is necessarily the ideal mechanism. You know, unions aren't necessarily diverse either, or that they're not historically by any means. So yeah, I think that's right. And clearly, yeah, there's other issues here. You mentioned corruption, and yeah, simply it would not be standard, I don't think, for many creative people now to be part of a union. I mean, I'm now here in New Zealand, there are some kind of informal groupings and some kind of guilds that support different kinds of arts and cultural workers. But, you know, I mean, I mentioned my work on Lord of the Rings a long time ago, and I know Mexico is somewhat similar in that New Zealand is now a location for big corporate money. You know, Amazon comes here, Hollywood studios come here, and it's because it's cheap, right? It's cheap. And all the workers are not unionized, right? That's the reason that we get all this money coming from Hollywood or, you know, from certain other productions. So there's this exploitation really built in to that relationship. And that will ensure we don't have formal union organization here for the film industry, for television, you know, for other kinds of arts and creative industries. And that's another interesting industrial context. I think it's still possible then to have a really interesting discussion about, you know, if Hollywood is coming to New Zealand to film, you know, Hollywood is very aware now about the issues around gender inequality. I mean, they have their whole Me Too conversation that's ongoing. So they have to at least like pay lip service, I think, and they have done so in New Zealand a little bit around, oh, we really care about, they use the term diversity. You know, this is the new kind of like vanilla term that often gets, oh, we really care about diversity and we want to promote diversity for your industry. Again, I think we have to like kind of call out the corporate language that gets used there. But like, I think there's a place for the unions that are present, there's a place for them in the conversation, but I do think we need to think about like what new kinds of organization could we build, across industries, and for freelance, creative people, especially, who would not be used to that kind of formal organization, but that have grievances in common, shall we say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we're getting to the end, but I will take this opportunity to talk about one of the topics developed that particularly caught my attention. How, despite the fact that there are a great integration of women and gender displaced person in this industry, it is important to look deeper and notice how there is segregation that relates women to care and education task, while the presence of men is concentrated in tasks related to the idea of creative individualistic genius. I want to talk about this figure. From the feminist studies, the colonial, from these approaches, a critic is made for the figure of genius artists, and is also a critic of the art that have only a purpose of producing a work of art. On the other hand, we have this artistic practice where creative people are integrated into society and the creative world from a more plural and communitarian approach. So especially in countries with we have these forms of discrimination, such as in Mexico, and even more in the time present in the middle of the pandemic, we need to talk about it. Why we need to do? We're still thinking in this figure of artists, of creative people. I want to talk about this topic. What you can share with us about this topic of the
Lorena, I love it. This is a great comment, question. I think we could talk. I'd love to talk to you about this for hours. I think we could have a really fruitful discussion here. Yeah, I have thought about this a huge amount. And in my research, really, I think this is the crux of it, actually, a lot of the time. This is the crux of the issue. That just simply, you're right, the way that creativity is understood at a much broader societal level and historically speaking, you're right, has become so focused on this individual creative genius, which absolutely, as you say, is associated with masculinity, right? It's the kind of lone hero, like the hero's journey. It's so fundamental, I think, to the building blocks, supposedly, of narrative drama. And it's very destructive because, yeah, you're right. On the other hand, we absolutely do have these. I mean, what is creativity if it isn't collaborative, communal, about a community, building this community? And that's all a theatre production or a film is about, building and creating a community that works together to produce that work of art. So it's so interesting to me that there's still that fundamental contradiction, like so many of the other contradictions we've discussed here. We get the genius, usually the male name of the director in lights, and then we have all the hundreds of people involved in the production, which clearly shows it's like it's a communal collaborative act. And yet those things, just are so often in opposition. Well, they're yeah. I mean, I'm not saying I have answers to this. It's an unanswerable question, but I think it's really interesting. I've certainly seen examples of, especially women, women with in decision-making power in these industries who are trying to build, really on the ground in the way that they work, building back towards that communal spirit. I mean, of course, now I'm going to blank on all these names, but I have written a little bit about this, about particular filmmakers who are kind of like, you know, I don't want that patriarchal, I'm not the patriarchal kind of genius at the top of this production. We're doing this together. We're part of a community, you know, building that language, the communal language to the language of creativity, you know, and doing that on the ground in the production of, you know, whatever kind of artistic practice we're speaking about. And the other thing that's interesting is, you know, I have a few colleagues that have done research in the United Kingdom, and I don't know if there's any examples of this in Mexico, but of like creative cooperatives, you know, a new kind of working organization, you know. So for a theatre company, for example, you know, it's designed, you know, as a cooperative, as in you have a group of people who are investing in the company, the production, and that means investing in the infrastructure and the actual office space, working together, you know, and it's a non-hierarchical structure, you know, so there's no kind of like one or two decision makers at the top, you know, it's like a group consensus. There's a little bit of work now about different kinds of creative cooperatives, which are, you know, trying to affect, again, that change, moving explicitly from like this individual genius notion, very hierarchical top-down structure, to a much more creative and collaborative structure. Now, those are pretty small scale. You know, the cooperatives that I know about in the United Kingdom are pretty small scale, but that's interesting, I think, as a pioneering, like a really concrete way of trying to do things differently and actually build a different governance structure. There's, you know, everyone is paid the same, you know, from top to bottom of the production. Whether that could really work in practice, I mean, I'm sure those that are heavily invested in the creative genius vision will say, oh, that would never work, you know, it's, you know, of course, but they would say that, wouldn't they? So I think we can always look for examples where, you know, we're kind of getting, I think, back to this like collaborative, communal, equitable spirit of creative expression.
Thank you. We have another comment from Stephen Morris, that's from Facebook Cultura UNAM, from the Facebook. He said, excellent presentation. I have a question. What is your opinion on stereotypes of women? How to include women from other cultures, not only from the West, if not women with realities of life that are not fairy tale? That is, what have you thought about the figure of women from other cultures and what to do in order to not marginalize them and include them in audiovisual media?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, really, I think you're signaling there a whole other area, which actually, you know, we haven't had much time to discuss today so far, which is about representation, right? I mean, this is a whole other really rich area that I think we need to talk more about. I mean, this is, I think, why it's so important to have this conversation, because, you know, those of us that are creatives, artists, storytellers, you know, there's a power that we all have, you know, to represent. Who do we represent? Whose voices, whose stories, what kind of visions of, you're right, masculinity, femininity, gender diversity, and, you know, that poses a particular kinds of problems for us as researchers, right? Because, of course, we can look at all the statistics, you know, how many, you know, men, women, gender diverse writers do we have in a particular industry? That doesn't necessarily tell us anything about who they're writing about or what we're seeing on stage or on screen. And it's hard to make a causal connection. You know, some people would say, oh, well, even if all my writers are, you know, like men of a certain age, they can still write, they can still produce equitable stories. They can still represent women, men, you know, kind of old, young, whatever. Is that, you know, is that true? Is that possible? It's hard to say. There's also a difficulty. I mean, I know we've had more discussions about this just in media discourse more generally. Who gets to speak for whom? You know, we've spoken a lot about this in my context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand recently. You know, Indigenous creatives, Māori creatives are arguing, you know, we need more of a seat at the table to tell our stories. And we can't have, you know, Pākehā, that is white settler storytellers, telling our stories for us. You know, they cannot tell our Indigenous stories. We need more resources, time and energy to do that. And I think the same for women, right? You know, as a woman, I don't, you know, I think I would rather women creators or a kind of gender diverse perspective telling more stories about different visions of like of gender. You know, it can't all be people from with the same point of view. How do we do that though? You know, like, again, this is like the $6 million question. You know, to take again New Zealand, just because this is the context I'm in at the moment, there have been some interesting innovations here around and actually, even in the context of COVID, whereas I've just said, you know, there's been lots of cuts to arts and culture, one thing that hasn't been cut, and it has in fact been increased, is, you know, again, it's this problematic term diversity, but a diversity fund for New Zealand writers. So for those writing for theatre, but also for film and television, other kinds of audiovisual media, more money has gone into just writer development, you know, and that is with a clear caveat to support writers that haven't been supported enough in the past. Women writers, Indigenous writers, disabled writers, writers with, you know, kind of different gender diverse backgrounds. So, you know, a lot more resource has gone into just funding, you know, development for a diversity of voices. Now that's only just been brought into place. So we'll have to see what are the results of that. Are we going to then see more, you know, diverse voices and visions on the screen? Maybe I'll have to come back to you in a couple of years and we'll see like what has come out of that development process. But I think it's just, you raise a really good point, which is that we need to also, as much as we talk about who's working in the industry, it's also about, you know, what are we seeing on stage, on screen, and where do we need to put our resources there?
Thank you. Well, we're getting to the end. I don't see other questions, just some comments that say a thank you and that is an excellent conference. I will come back to the name of the book. Being on the edge of the precipice seems like a destiny from which we cannot escape. However, you mark a halo of hope. What's next? To fall? Or will it be possible to build bridges to cross the precipice, or even to open the wings? In that part, talking about migration, do you think that in order to change the panorama of inequalities, it is important to transform the very structures of the cultural industry?
Yes, yes, I do. Let's rebuild them from the ground up, I think. Lorena, that's a beautiful comment, I think, to kind of finish on. Your vision of building bridges is crucial, and building wings. I mean, this is just really, really lovely language and visions for us. I think, you know, we're at this very interesting moment. I mean, here we are, we're like in different parts of the world, and we're able to have this conversation from our homes. This is quite new, and I know there's a privilege, you know, to this that allows me to kind of be here and do that. But I think we can take some important lessons from what we have all been through in the last 18 months. We can build, I think, from the ground up these industries, but yes, I think they do require rebuilding, which means maybe a little bit of creative destruction is still needed. You know, like, you know, we need to work together to, I think, remake these industries in a more equitable way, to build the bridges from where we were to where we want to get to. And that's to like ensure we don't move further back, you know, like and erode the progress that we've made. And yes, I think a fundamental rebuilding is needed, but it's possible also right now in this moment.
Thank you so much. Definitely, I'm very grateful for your dedication to this topic and for leaving us a valuable document that serves us not only to reflect, but also to begin a transformative action. Thank you very much to all the audience and see you soon. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so much, Lorena. Thank you. Great to see you all.
Lorena, Bridget, ha sido un verdadero honor para Cultura UNAM, para Teatro UNAM y para el festival el haber podido contar con sus opiniones y con su voz, ¿no? En este tema, esta mesa, esta conferencia se ha podido desarrollar gracias a la intervención del British Council México, que fue quien nos ayudó a localizar a Bridget y a poder hacer posible que se desarrollara, ¿no? Es también importante para mí comentarles que esta mesa está irada a otras actividades dentro del festival, como fue la mesa sobre la impronta del feminismo en las artes escénicas iberoamericanas que se desarrolló hace 2 días, ¿no? Que pueden todavía consultar en nuestro canal de YouTube. Y además también está ligado a talleres y obras que se escenificarán durante los próximos días, que considero es fundamental pensar de manera integral en relación a este tema, que no puede ser un tema pasajero, es un tema que debe ser no eventual, sino permanente, ¿no? Y por otro lado, además de reiterar mi profundo agradecimiento a ambas y rogarle a Bridget que tengamos el canal de comunicación permanente para seguir trabajando con ella entre la UNAM y sus procesos de investigación, invitarlos a que el día de mañana participen con nosotros en el siguiente conversatorio, un recorrido por el cómo se desarrolla el Festival Cielos del Infinito. Para quienes no lo conozcan, un festival que se hace en lo más lejano que podemos encontrar en relación a nuestro país, que es Chile, al sur de nuestro continente, este festival absolutamente independiente que ha generado vínculos con festivales de diferentes partes del mundo y que nos dará una lección de cómo operar desde la independencia. También los invito a seguir visitando la exposición Seremos, esta exposición sobre los colectivos emergentes de artes escénicas en México, que está disponible a través de la página de Teatro UNAM. Y por último, volver a agradecer. Muchas gracias, Bridget, no solo la intervención hoy con nosotros, sino el estudio desarrollado para la Unesco. Creo que pone en valor realmente el nivel de preocupación que debemos tener hacia el tema. De verdad, gracias. Te aplaudimos de pie, te damos una ovación de pie y reiteramos nuestro profundo agradecimiento. Muchas gracias, Lorena. Tengan todas, todos, todes muy buenas noches desde esta Ciudad de México, en la cual está lloviendo bastante en este momento. Un gran abrazo y sigan, por favor, las actividades del Festival Internacional de Teatro Universitario. Thanks a lot, Bridget.
Thank you, Juan.